Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery to quickly check in on my bin of finished compost. And it wasn't very long ago that this bin of finished compost was harvested from two completed bins. And the original idea was just to let this stuff sit and evaporate and dry off a little bit because I felt to me like the material was a little bit damp, more damp than I think is ideal. And then a number of people just started suggesting, hey, there's probably a lot of worms in there. And I think we did actually observe a fair number of worms in the material as we were harvesting the compost. And a lot of people suggested, why don't we try to bait those worms out as long as the material is just going to be sitting around. So I took those suggestions to heart. And it was 6 days ago that I set up a container in here with the objective of baiting any worms that are hanging out in the material. And back then too, we had used about this much cantaloupe rinds, although I don't think we used any grit last time. So I've got my pulverized eggshell here so we can kind of beef up the reload of this baiting mechanism that I've got set up. So all we're really going to do now is we're going to extract the little baiting mechanism that I had set up. And we're going to see how many worms we were able to coerce out of the finished compost. And then what I've got is my newest bin, which is only a couple weeks old, if that. And that's where we're going to put any of the worms that have congregated now. One thing I did do, if you watched the last video on this, is I did place another coffee filter right here on top, which was really just meant to keep the moisture down. And if you remember, this thing was topped off. It was all the way up to the tippy top. And it does look like it has settled considerably. So, you know, there again, I'm not going to actually treat that as settling. I'm going to treat that as consumption. I'm going to assume that the worms have made their way into the bait and have been eating it and working it down. So I guess what we're expecting to see here is a fair number of worms hanging out. If you peek down into the hole, though, what you can see down there is a number of worms hanging out right beneath where the bait was, which is also to be expected. You're going to expect to see some worms hanging out right below. And what you see down there is also a coffee filter. I just thought that it might be a good idea to rest the bait bomb on top of the coffee filter rather than just having it rest on the compost down below. Not that it would really make much of a difference. So, but yeah, I'm going to just rest this aside briefly, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to retrieve that coffee filter. So I guess what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and we'll just treat that coffee filter as stuff to include with the worms when we move it over into the newest of my bins. So we'll get back to this one to reload it momentarily. But now we're just going to slide over the newest of my bins, which is where we're going to release the worms. But before we release them, we're going to check them out. And what I've got going on here is what I usually use as my feeding zone marker. So we'll just use that as sort of a platform to drop them onto so we can better see what we ended up with. And then we'll just release them down into the material when we're done checking it out. So I'm just really curious to see how many worms made their way over into here. Looks like a fair number, and it also looks like there's a couple of them in here too, so we'll try to fish them out later. But and we're just going to try to get a sense of how much of the food they consumed. Some of the it does look like some of these cantaloupe rinds are not quite done yet, although some of them do look quite heavily stripped. This one here looks like all of the fleshy, meaty part of the cantaloupe has been consumed and eaten, whereas this one over here seems like it was hardly touched. This one has no meaty material on it, neither does this one. So maybe they were just resting up against each other, making it harder for the worms to gain access to it. But it does look like we've got ourselves a fair number of worms that have come together to feast on this bait. So that's good to see. I wish there was some way to tell how many worms we've really got remaining in the remainder of that finished compost over there, back in the compost bin. So maybe before we relaunch the bait bomb, or whatever we want to call this thing, the baiting cage. Maybe we'll just take a peek through the material to see if we can get a better view of what all is still creeping and crawling through the material there. Come on, wormy. There we go. Okay, so it does seem like this works pretty well. If you didn't watch my first video when I launched this thing, you're welcome to check it out. I'll put a link for it up here in the corner. But this is the filter enclosure, so the pond pump that I used to have. The pond pump has since broken down, but this used to be the enclosure for the filter. So you would attach this to the pond pump, the filter would rest inside, and it would draw water through the filter, and the water would be inletted through these holes here. So it seemed like this was a pretty good device to try to use for this, and it does seem like it's doing the trick, so I like what I'm seeing here. So we'll go ahead and we'll continue to use this going forward. Put them to rest to the side right now, and we're just going to let these little guys loose. I feel bad for kind of keeping them exposed to this bright light for so long. You know, they don't like it. Look at that. Have you ever seen a worm burrito before? Alright, we're just going to rest our little worm burrito off to the side here just so I can kind of dig a little bit of a hole here, and we'll just put them down into the material so they're in a nice comfortable spot so they don't have to feel like they've got to flee. I guess this is also another quick opportunity for us to check in on how the last feeding is progressing on this bin here. Still see a banana peel right here. Some sticks, I guess. Some stuff probably just came in with the leaves that I've been laying down. This looks like a cantaloupe rind. So it does seem like they're doing a pretty good job working their way through the last feeding, but there's also, on the flip side, a fair amount of it remaining. So we weren't here to feed necessarily. We were just here to give these guys a place to be set free. So we'll put our little worm burrito right into the middle of the feeding zone of our newest bin. And we'll just be now upping our population in this bin by that many more worms. So yep, let's get this bin back up on the shelf where it belongs. And actually I got the newspaper for it over there. I'll get that covered up as well. But I just want to get our compost container back in view here, just so we could get the bait bomb resituated within the finished compost. But let's check out how things are going as long as we're in here, right? I got a glove on. We've removed the bait. So before we reset it, we can kind of get a sense of how this evaporation effort of the material is progressing, as well as the depopulation, the baiting of the worms from the material. So this is pretty promising. I'm just, poking around here on the edge, and here we go. Found a worm. But I haven't seen many so far, so that's pretty promising. I actually like the consistency of this stuff too. It's improving for sure. It's becoming more crumbly and less muddy. And I guess the other nice thing about what I'm doing here is that I could take some of that material that has sort of dried already from the top, from the upper surface, and kind of scrape it off to the side and drop it down low, and conversely we'll also have a chance then to move some of the more damp material from down low out to the surface to give it all a good opportunity to dry off a little bit here. So I definitely can feel a difference as I run my fingers through it and as I observe how it flakes apart as I'm moving it around. This is definitely what I was after. I was definitely after a more flaky material. And if you watched that last video, and I invite you to check it out, then and that's not even the last video, because the last video was, I believe, more about just getting the bait bomb launched. You might have to actually check out the video even prior to that, when I was harvesting these castings. So I guess another thing I could do then is I could go ahead and I could post a video to link to that video up in the corner as well for you to check out. And then you'll be able to see the difference in terms of the moisture content of the material. So here's another worm that I just encountered in my digging, but I believe that this baiting is kind of doing the trick, you know. Here and there, a couple more worms as we make our way through. But not as many as I had thought we would encounter. I mean, the number of worms that I saw in that bait box didn't really match what I was expecting to see in terms of all of them. Like if all the worms that I thought were in this were piled up, I was expecting that we'd have quite a bit more than what we saw in that little bait box. And as long as I think that there's still worms cruising around in here, we can certainly continue to reload the bait mechanism to try to lure them out. I mean, if it does eventually seem like all the worms have exited the material, and that would also include any worms that may have, you know, been hatched out of cocoons. So there's always that possibility that there's unhatched worm cocoons in this material too, which have yet to hatch and could potentially spawn off some baby worms. So now this makes sense too. Right down here is where we're starting to find a lot of worms, and they're all hanging out right below where the bait bomb was because of all that juicy deliciousness coming out of the cantaloupe brines. They were, you know, maybe not necessarily right in the cantaloupe brines eating the melon itself, but they were enjoying the fluid that was dripping down off of the cantaloupe brines. So yeah, that also kind of makes sense that we're finding some right down here below where the bait bomb was. So, all right, so I guess, you know, we were just curious to see if there's still a lot of worms in here, and it does seem like we've still got a fair number of worms. We were curious to see if the material is making good progress towards becoming a more dry and flaky substance, as opposed to being a real clumpy and muddy kind of a gooey mess, which I believe it is also becoming. So I think we're making good progress in the direction of where this stuff is headed. So I believe we can definitely allocate one more baiting session at least to this material. So yeah, let's go ahead and we'll do that. I'm not going all the way down to the bottom. I just wanted to sort of rest here within the material. So I'm leaving a little bit of material down at the bottom for this to rest on. Going to kind of break it up to make it easier for the worms to travel through. So enter the bait again, and I'll just set it off to the side here because all we really need now is the box to put it into. So all right, a lot of chit chat, let's just do it. I'm just wondering if I've got nearly as much as I had previously. I've already dropped in half of it and we're not even scratching the surface here. Let me just drop in a little bit of eggshell, pulverized eggshell as grit while we're at it. And you know, I guess another thing we can maybe do is just to sort of fluff this up a little bit better and to use the space. I'm just going to use another one of these coffee filters, kind of crumble it up a little bit and just rest it in here halfway through, and you kind of treat it as sort of a bedding layer, if you will, in between some of the food. So the food on the bottom, now there will be the food on the top. We'll kind of fluff it all up a bit and get us a little bit closer to the top of the container. Give us the sense of it being kind of close to being full, just to use that as a measure of how we're doing. So that looks pretty good to me. And we'll just put that other piece of filter right on top. And that's more, I believe, just for retention of moisture, so it holds in the moisture a little bit better. And then we're going to set up like we did previously. We're just going to set up a little bit of a platform on which we're going to rest the bait bomb, you know, as opposed to simply just placing it into the compost directly. Alrighty. So this is definitely taking a lot longer than I thought it would. And you know why? Because I'm doing what I always do. I you know, start seeing worms, I start chit-chatting, I start probing further. Just always trying to satisfy my curiosity. Can't seem to help it. So And I think the other advantage to having fluffed up all this material the way we just did too is, you know, if it, just in case it was kind of dense and packed together tight, then I think that would make it a little bit harder for the worms to actually traverse the material, you know, to travel through it. And I do want the worms to be able to, you know, very easily get through it. And if they, you know, if they sense that there's some scrumptious, delicious melon nearby, so that it would be, you know, easy for them to make their way over to it and not be impeded by, you know, a whole bunch of really dense, wet compost. But I think we're definitely on the road to recovery here. Road to recovery here, in terms of addressing, you know, compost that was perhaps a little bit more damp than I would have wanted it to be. So, all right, a lot of chit chat. I believe we're done. um, I'll just go back and, you know, do all the things that I normally do. I'll cover up the other bin, and I'll cover this up and get it up on the shelf. But that's it for today. It's going to wrap up and say thank you. Thank you for coming, and thanks for watching the video. I appreciate your company. And you know, like always, I always really appreciate a thumbs up. So if you enjoyed the video, you found it useful and insightful, then or interesting or entertaining, then just give me a thumbs up. I really appreciate that. And also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel. That's always really appreciated as well. And you know, naturally, if you got any questions or comments, then put them down into the comments section down below. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks again for watching. Bye now.